I suppose Wind and Wuthering came after a bit more confidence, having had Trick of the Tail do well. I think in some respects, the edge and the excitement of Trick of the Tail, you know, the edginess of will it work or not, and did work, for me made Wind and Wuthering, the writing seemed a little flatter to me, I think, because it was slightly more, you're thinking about it more, you'd done the first one without thinking about it, just gone and done it without Peter, and this was like it's like the second one's always a bit harder, the second album, they always say, you know. I think Wind and Wuthering is probably very much Tony's album favourite. He was very much, I think, involved in the sound of that one. Probably the album he had the most, I think, influence, actually. One for the Vine, Afterglow. And I always see it as a feminine album. There are no real kind of ballsy driving songs on this album, which I think has probably suffered for a little bit. But I think Afterglow is still a classic. I think it still sounds great.
But I would search everywhere.
And actually another song I think is very important is Blood on the Rooftops, which is quite important, a big part of Steve on that one. And it's a lovely song. It's a forgotten song. And every time you hear it, you kind of go, wow, that's nice. I didn't rate that so much. I think it's one of Steve's best moments, actually, on the writing side, really.
There's quite a lot of music written beforehand on this album, and I think when we finished the album, the only thing that worried me a little bit was perhaps the album was more, particularly when we left off the 3 tracks we did, which were all kind of quite simple tracks, that the album was really quite a heavy album, quite a difficult album. But I mean, I liked that. You see, I always thought I like an album to be a challenge, and it wasn't an album that was going to be liked first time. Apart from possibly Your Own Special Way, virtually every other track requires quite a bit of listening, I think, to get into. And but at that time, I think, you know, we were able to, you know, I think we had people who were prepared to give us the time. Some people, you know, I remember the reviews of the album were a bit like, oh, disappointing after Trick of the Tail type thing. But I think for the fans, it's a better album.
Pete and Tony were like this, you know. I mean, best of friends, but like this. And possibly with Peter having long gone by this point, Tony realising that possibly, you know, I mean, he was able to sort of, like Mercury, kind of sort of spread out a little bit and get much more of him out. And of course, with me not writing, and maybe Steve writing, but not everybody liking what he was bringing in, there was only him and Mike, really, apart from us as a group, which was always a very important part of us. I mean, us writing together with out of nothing was always one of the strong things of Genesis, anyway. But yeah, so for feminine, read romantic. For romantic, read Tony. So.
I think it's a romantic album. That's probably why I like it as much as I do. I'm sort of, perhaps that era of music excites me more in a way. The chords are much more sort of expansive, if you like, and the way they change is sort of more yearning. You know, it's not. This is about as far away as you can get from sort of straight ahead 3-chord rock. You know, and although I like a bit of that myself, but this album's is far away from it.
They get me confused, boy, puts me off to sleep, and the thing I hate, oh Lord.
I enjoyed doing Blood on the Rooftops. I mean, I took a flyer on that one by doing this whole sort of classical guitar introduction to it, so I enjoyed doing that. I think that came out very well. I think it's a very well produced album. I think that, as I say, particularly with the new mixes, you can hear a little more guitar.
It's kind of been growing in confidence, I think, over the years with Genesis. I mean, you know, you must appreciate that when we started off, that both Phil and Steve were very much junior members, particularly in relation to the composition. You know, and I think at this stage, you know, with Mike and I had sort of perhaps been dominant, certainly on Trick of the Tail, and we probably were on Wind and Wuthering as well, I think. But he definitely had more moments when he came to the fore. And this was particularly true, I think, on Blood on the Rooftops, which I think is a lovely track. It's one of my favourite tracks we did.
Blood on the rooftops. Then you sing the spring.
The chorus musically of Blood on the Rooftops was Phil's, and the idea for the title of the song was Phil's, Blood on the Rooftops. I did the rest of the lyrics and the verse and the intro, so that's me, and luckily the band went to town on it, and we had Mellotron and everything, and it's pretty sort of dark, very English sounding tune, where all the levels of action happen on the TV. So it's a sort of song about couch potatoes in a way, but maybe the younger generation is differing slightly from what the older generation is saying. Yeah, it's not a bad lyric.
At that time, you see, we're talking about 77, and I had yet to really write. I wrote bits. One of my bits ended up on the Lamb. My strength in Genesis, even though I was the singer, up until and including Wind and Wuthering, was as an arranger. I could see how other people's material could work, or could be arranged like this or like that, or why don't you play that and I could play this. An interpreter, if you like. And so I had these little bits, and I think Steve and I think probably reading between the lines, Steve was starting to get a bit frustrated because he had his material that he was doing on his own albums, and obviously this was probably the last album he did. So he, by this point, without me knowing, certainly he was starting to feel a bit frustrated about his lack of, ability to sort of contribute to the band.
Probably throughout the whole of the period with the band. I mean, I always thought, what would it be like if I wasn't with the band? I mean, I used to think that the band were very accomplished songwriters, and I very often used to find it intimidating working with people who were so gifted and who were so quick and brilliant. And it took, I think, a long time for my confidence, to get to the point where I felt like an equal. I think it probably didn't happen until Wind and Wuthering, really.
Filled their minds with awe. Simple were the folk who lived.
When Pete left, we had a moment we suddenly realised, we kind of went, shit, do you know what? We've always called the song Genesis, which means no one knows who wrote what. And as one always imagined the singer writes most of it, we suddenly thought, God, if any people knew who wrote what, they wouldn't be so worried about what comes next. But of course, you can't suddenly tell them that. So I think after that, subconsciously, we started to sort of push more our own credits. Who wrote what, you know what I mean? And I think individually, and that's probably not a... And the next album was the worst one of all, and then Duke, we started going back to how we started originally, writing together more. So we were heading in the direction, I think, where it was like a couple of my songs, a couple of Tony's songs, a couple of group songs. It wasn't. It was a funny road we were taking.
The three main songs I wrote on this, I wrote totally on my own, which was obviously The One for the Vine, Afterglow, and All on a Mouse's Night. When I played One for the Vine to the guys, it was kind of like I just played the whole thing through with me sort of warbling on top, and I don't know what they thought at the end of that. But I think they thought if we don't do it, he'll get so irritable, start throwing things, that we'll have to have a go at it, So we just put it down in the studio. I just put the whole thing down with the piano and drums, really, and then we sort of overdubbed everything else on top of it. And it was just faith, really, in the end, that they sort of stuck with me, I think. Because I think it turned out good, actually, and I think the contribution of all the others is really good as well. So it's I was quite pleased with that. But I mean, because that song had really taken me, since Trick of the Tail, I'd sort of been working on that and honing it and trying to get it right. Whereas the song Afterglow, which was the final song, I really wrote just about in the time it took to play it. I just sort of sat down and thought, I just fancied using that chord sequence, and then started singing on it. And I was really excited by that, because I thought, I don't normally do things like that. And then about a couple of days after I'd written, I suddenly thought, shit, what I've done is I've written Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas again. It was a terrible thought, and I was thinking, Have Yourself, and I listened to that particular song and realised it wasn't the same. I could get away with it, but it's a terrible moment when you think, God, I'll never get away with it. But Yeah, so I mean, I think Afterglow, which obviously then became a big stage favourite, it was just a very strong kind of, you know, sort of anthemic kind of piece, which I think closed the album really well. So I think, you know, I was very pleased with that.
What Gorilla was actually one of my favourite songs on the whole record, because it was a bit more of my Los Endos thing coming in the door. You know, it was my fusion kind of weather reporting side of me that I was able to sort of make Tony Banks play this stuff, you know, and they seemed to like it. So that ended up on the album.
In those days, I was still doing a lot of guitar tunings, playing 12 strings with funny, weird tunings, sometimes tuning the double strings in harmony, which is quite unusual. And Your Special Way was done with a funny tuning. What it was, I think I never got a clue of finding it again, so I can't see us doing it on stage. I'd found a way to play it straight chords. But it was a nice moment. It was a single in America too. And suddenly, it was the first time when the record label thought, it didn't do anything, but it got some airplay. They felt, hang on, maybe this band can do something that we can actually play on the radio, apart from the long songs that got played on late night radio. So it was the sort of start of a tickle in America, I think, from that sense.
You have your special way.
At the same time as we were doing Wind and Wuthering, there was this sort of this punk thing was starting as well, which we kind of just didn't really glance at too much. We just ignored it.
Genesis were always slightly outside the loop in terms of the firing line, which is not a bad thing actually. It works both ways. You get less press, but it also means you get, you know, when the press is bad, you get less bad press. I don't know, I kind of felt outside it already. I didn't really feel. I saw it was quite fun coming in. I think it was a good time for music, because I think a lot of bands got to a stage when actually you couldn't make an album without spending a fortune and having all the big mixers and all the gear, you know, and punk came in a bit like in a couple of amps and just do it, which I think was very healthy. And I think it was like shaking the apple tree. I think the good ones stayed and the bad ones came down. We managed to fool them all, obviously.
I did think that it's yes, but they're not talking about us. They're talking about those other bands that I don't like either. You know, I mean, good. You know, let's get rid of them other lot. You know, they can't be talking about us. You know, of course they were talking about us, but I actually agreed. You know, I loved all that stuff.
I don't think Genesis has ever really pandered to anything. I mean, styles or fashions. I think we've always been in our own little sort of world, really.
But now the cat comes in for the kill. This porous race from blood will spill. Yes, it will.
Well, I know Tony's fond of it. I'm fond of it. I think it was an album that was probably uncompromised. I think it's still an album. I think it was uncompromised by the need to have hit singles. I don't think there are too many of them on there. I think latterly, perhaps Afterglow could have made that a hit single. My Strongest Song, Blood on the Rooftops, I doubt would have made a single. But you know, we were making an album at that time, and there weren't the pressures of having to do 3-minute songs that were going to be acceptable for video, etc. So I do think it's the band at its best, doing perhaps what it did best, at least with my inclusion in it. So I am very fond of it.
For me, it's one of my two favourite Genesis albums. I think it's got so many good moments on it, so that's the way I feel about it. But I think it's the most extreme of a certain kind of album. It's the most extreme in terms of the kind of the harmonic area, and probably the most complex in musical terms of all the albums we did, I think.